2, 1, and liftoff.
The dream of flight into space is as old as astronomy. Once people learned that the lights in the sky were actual planets like Earth itself, they've had the irresistible urge to travel to them and discover the fantastic mysteries they withheld. Although this has been a dream as old as time, space exploration was triggered not by the desire for exploration, but by the rivalry between two super political powers. These two powers began a heated struggle to outsmart each other in space knowledge and technology, and thus began the battle between them, known as the space race. The space race was an intense competition between the United States of America and the Soviet Union during the period of the Cold War. The starting shot was fired with the launch of the first man-made satellites to space in 1957, but its origins trace back to the 19th century, at the hands of three scientists who are considered to be the founding fathers of modern rocketry and astronautics. Eduardovich taught himself physics and the mechanics of rocket propulsion. He worked out the theory of rockets, in which a vehicle's maximum velocity can be expressed as a function of its mass and its exhaust gases. Goddard pioneered modern rocketry in the USA and funded fields of science and engineering. His contribution was developing a liquid-fueled rocket engine with many ideas from Eduardovich's rocket theory, and by 1926 he had launched several successful rockets. Albert was the youngest and perhaps the most influential. He presented the discoveries made by his predecessors in writing some books that reached a wider audience. One of his books, The Rocket Influence for Planetary Space, inspired a young scientist to investigate further on the topic of rocketry, and later assisted this young scientist in the creation of the V-2 rocket.
Despite the work of Tsiolkovsky, Albert, and Goddard, it was the German V-2 rocket that first introduced the possibility of space travel into the minds of scientists. In 1944, towards the end of World War II, Germany launched the most powerful rocket the world had seen, the V-2. It traveled at 4 times the speed of sound and went halfway into space before hitting its target. It was the first rocket to achieve suborbital spaceflight and marked the beginning of the space age. After the end of World War II, USA and the USSR emerged as the two superpowers. Both sides captured a team of V-2 rocket specialists and with their help soon created their own missiles. The Soviet R-1 rocket and the American PGM-11 rocket were almost direct copies of the V-2, but once the USA and USSR had a hold of their own ballistic missiles, research began on how to improve these rockets, research that paved the way for space exploration. However, with tension between the two superpowers and the start of the Cold War, research turned into competition, and the space race officially began as American and Soviet scientists battled to develop the largest and fastest rockets for battle. The V-2 rocket soon advanced to become intercontinental ballistic missiles on both sides. However, in the early 1950s, the American military gave little priority to the further development of these ICBMs, whilst the Soviet Union employed a large body of research on those rockets especially. It is this decision that ultimately placed the USSR in the lead during the next decade of the space race. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was one of the engineers working on transforming rocket weapons into space instruments, and he is widely regarded as the founder of the Soviet space program. The successful launch of Korolev's R-7 in August 1957 proved that the Soviets had the ability to initiate a rocket into orbit. This ability is shown when just 2 months later, in October 1957, the Soviets launched their first satellite, Sputnik 1, known for its characteristic sounds. Sputnik was the first man-made object to orbit the Earth. The launch of the Sputnik satellite was not celebrated in the USA, where citizens were under the impression that the USA had fallen behind the Soviet Union in the areas of science and technology. Their insecurities were further fueled by the failed launch of the Vanguard TV-3. The Vanguard TV-3 was intended to be the first vehicle to launch the first American satellite into space. However, on December 6, 1957, the rocket exploded several seconds after liftoff. USA's first success in the space race came in January 1958 when their first satellite, Explorer 1, was launched into orbit. However, despite the best efforts of the USA, the Soviet Union remained ahead with space exploration throughout the remainder of the late 1950s and early 1960s.
The space race entered its most technologically challenging phase during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. During the 1960s, the space race increased its importance in the Cold War struggle. It took on a much more serious and urgent role. John F. Kennedy, the president leading the USA into the new decade, was willing right from the beginning to show his support for competing in this contest, stating in his inaugural speech of January 1961,
"Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars."
However, it was the Soviets that made the first move of the decade, and it was a very memorable one. On the 12th of April 1961, they launched Vostok 1, holding 27-year-old Yuri Gagarin into space. This was the first time a human had left the Earth's atmosphere, and Gagarin very nearly did not survive re-entry. Yet this came at a time when the Soviets were at a peak. The Berlin Wall was being set up, and they felt they were ahead where space exploration was concerned. This gave them a further boost of confidence. The USA was not far behind, however, and only a month later had sent their own US troops, US citizen Alan Shepard, into space. The Soviets had what seemed the upper hand for the next 5 years, whilst the USA dealt with the assassination of Kennedy, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights struggle, and the situation in Cuba. During this time, the Soviets made the first day-long spaceflight, placed the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space, launched the first multi-person spaceflight, and made the first spacewalk. Their space exploration efforts petered out towards the end of the decade, perhaps due to the change in leader, as Leonid Brezhnev took over from Nikita Khrushchev in 1964. 2 years after the inauguration of Lyndon B. Johnson in 1963, the USA's space endeavors took off. They made the longest recorded space missions, coordinated the first space rendezvous between two aircraft, and made the first lunar orbit flight. However, an event that took to the USA overshadowed all previous achievement from both sides was landing a spacecraft on the moon. This they achieved on the 20th of July 1969. The decade ended with the USA thinking they were the winners with their claim to the moon, and the Soviet Union believing they had won from the moment they set the first human into space. How would the next decade of space exploration map out? The 1970s brought what all citizens involved in the Cold War had feared from the moment space was infringed upon by humans. In June 1971, just a year after what the Soviets saw as Yuri Gagarin's heroic flight, Soviet scientists launched the first space station. The USA realized what a potential threat this may be and initiated peace talks. The Soviets were interested. Both sides knew the situation would spiral out of control if it was not stopped. Following the agreement, both sides continued their space exploration into the 1980s and are still doing so today, but the pressure of competition was off and science took the front seat.
It is quite difficult to pinpoint the exact date of the end of the space race, as opinions differ on both sides. While the USSR claimed that they had won by sending the first man into space, the US believed that they had been more successful, seeing as they were the first to get to the moon. After President Nixon proposed negotiations in order to ease the relations between the two superpowers, both the US and the USSR saw that there was now room for cooperation rather than competition. They were united in their first joint mission, which aimed to dock an American craft with a Soviet one. This was known as the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, or the SATP. The project began on July 15, 1975, when Soyuz was launched at 12:30 Coordinated Universal Time. Apollo followed 6.5 hours later. The two craft successfully docked on July 17th. The 3 US astronauts and the 2 Soviet cosmonauts shook hands, exchanged presents, and proceeded to conduct shared experiments. They became one crew, no longer competing, but instead cooperating. It is this symbolic moment that marks what is traditionally and internationally perceived as being the official end of the space race. Following this achievement, the two superpowers went back to working on their own projects. However, the tension and competition were no longer the huge issues they had been several years back. The relations between the two countries' space organizations eased. Additionally, they were also focusing on developing different aspects of space exploration. The US designed and began working on the Space Shuttle, the first generation of durable and reusable spacecraft. Meanwhile, the USSR aimed to improve space station technology. This difference in interests on both sides ensured the end of most of the space-related rivalry between the two superpowers.